And good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this webinar on the topic of effective strategies for resource allocation and use at school and regional levels. This is the third in our series of webinars presented by the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, known as EASNIE for short. My name, as Maria said, is Diana Murdoch, and I'll be moderating today's session, and thank you very much for joining us. Just to give you a little bit of overview of the project that the webinar is part of, this is a project called Combating Disparities in Access to Inclusive Education in Portugal, Italy and Spain. It's a technical support instrument TSI project, and it's funded by the European Commission SG Reform. The aim of the project is to promote equal access and to combat regional disparities in implementing inclusive education provision across the three countries. And this webinar is part of the project's capacity building phase. A little bit of background about the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education itself. EASNIE is a technical provider in this project. We work closely with SG Reform and with education ministries in the three participating countries, Italy, Portugal and Spain. It's a platform for collaboration, for peer learning for its over 30 country members, and its aim is to help countries improve their inclusive education policies. EASNIE also cooperates with international organizations and engages educators, experts, learners and families to ensure high quality educational opportunities for all. In order to give a little better idea about the work that we do, we're going to show you a very short video.
In an inclusive classroom, learners can grow alongside their friends and peers. The opportunity for everyone to work as a team and build lasting relationships is a cornerstone of an equitable educational environment. The European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education supports ministries of education as they put this ideal into practice. We provide a platform for collaboration, working with over 30 member countries to ensure high-quality educational opportunities for all learners. The agency fosters transnational cooperation with organisations like the European Commission and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, as well as educators, experts, learners and their families. Together, we work towards inclusive education throughout Europe. To realise our vision, we have built a peer learning framework. We create ways for member countries to exchange knowledge, combining policy, practice and research perspectives. At the agency, we facilitate peer learning in a variety of ways. Country policy reviews provide snapshots of member countries' educational policy frameworks. Data collection offers insight into statistics such as enrolment rates. Thematic projects involve policymakers, researchers, school leaders, teachers, parents and learners, looking at topics such as financing policies for inclusive education systems. And finally, through the European Commission Structural Reform Support Service, we address individual challenges identified by ministries of education relating to policy reforms and implementation. Through these activities, we produce evidence-based policy recommendations to inform and improve inclusive education systems. We also identify goals that schools and educators can work towards. And importantly, we encourage cohesion for a brighter future across Europe, because everyone benefits when we can share our strengths and learn from others.
Thank you. I hope that gives you a little bit of a more idea of how we work here in the European Agency. So we are very fortunate to have three speakers with us at our webinar today. Professor Mel Ainscow, who will speak first, Associate Professor Symeonidou, and Paula Hunt, who will speak later. Our speakers are all experts with a very rich variety of experience and knowledge across policy and practice in inclusive and special education. Please feel free to add questions for the speakers into the Q&A feature along the bottom of Zoom. So Professor Mel Ainscow is Emeritus Professor, University of Manchester, Professor of Education, the University of Glasgow, and Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. Mel has a very long-term consultancy to UNESCO, and he's internationally recognized as an authority on the promotion of inclusion and equity in education. His book, Developing Inclusive Schools Pathways to Success, was recently published in April 2024 by Routledge and in Spanish by Narcia in February 2025. Mel, we're absolutely delighted that you're able to join us today, and thank you so much. I'm looking forward very much to your presentation to us. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's very nice to be part of the group. Are the slides clear? Can you see the slides? Yeah, fine, thank you.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, well, it'd been quite interesting to think about what I might say in this presentation. So the event has already worked for me, and I hope it will work for you as well. I'm going to draw on experiences in Portugal, but I also will link them to experiences in other countries. Just to say by way of introduction, I've been involved in Portugal since 1995. Despite my appearance, I'm quite old. And since that time, almost by luck at times, but also because of collaboration with various partners, I've been involved in a whole series of initiatives in Portugal, projects, research studies, conferences, and so on. And so as I've been going along, obviously, I've been reflecting on the developments in Portugal. And I think I'd want to also say by way of introduction, I'm not setting up as Portugal is the perfect place to go as far as inclusion is concerned. Of course, it's on a journey, as every one of our countries are. That said, I think I would say, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying these issues in different parts of the world, I think Portugal has made enormous progress, and I think it can be an inspiration to us, and I think it can also help us to think about what we do in our own place. I think another thing that I've learned about all of this is that context matters. So that means what works in one place might not work in another. That said, I think we can learn by visiting and hearing about what happens in other parts of the world. So in that spirit is what I'm going to talk about. What I think I've learned from Portugal, linking it to other places, and inviting you to think about what this means for the places where you work. Okay. I set my interest, of course, in relation to all this in terms of Sustainable Development Goal 4. As you know, going back to 1990, the United Nations organizations have had a whole series of initiatives that have tried to promote forms of education which we now talk about as being inclusive and equitable. Probably a major turning point in that respect was 2016 with the publication of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goal 4, as you know, is the one that is concerned with education. As part of my work with UNESCO in 2017, I chaired a group of international experts who came together to design a guide. And that's the guide that's on the screen, a guide for ensuring inclusion and equity in education. It's available in a series of languages on the UNESCO website. So if you Google it, you will find it. And what it's meant to do is it provides a kind of framework of indicators and questions which can be used in a country or in a district or in a province to look at a system and say, what do we need to move the system forward? And of course, that is my agenda. That's what I think about and work on all the time. The group came up with this rather helpful motto, if you like. It's really a principle, and it's what guides all my work. Every learner matters and matters equally. So when I'm working with groups of schools, as I do sometimes, or with individuals or with countries, that is the kind of principle that's in my mind. Every learner matters and matters equally. Definitions are crucial in all of this. What we know from lots of international research is education systems are amongst the most difficult social institutions to change. Not because people are resistant or lazy, of course some are, but more because the really key people in all of this, in education change, are very busy. And of course, the most important people in all of this are teachers. It's teachers who are the policymakers as far as children are concerned. So if we're to move a policy forward, we have to take people with us, and we need to have clarity. Now, terms like inclusion and equity in themselves, I think, can create barriers because they're jargon, they're language that people like me use, but do they speak to the most important people, teachers, families, children, and young people? So what I've thought about for a long time and keep changing my mind, I might change my mind again this afternoon, is how do I see the process of inclusion? I've called it taking an inclusive turn. What that implies is moving in a new direction. So this is what my version of that inclusion turn is. My view is that inclusion is a process, not a state. It's a journey, if you will, and it's a never-ending journey. And when I sometimes work with schools that are well down the road in that journey, sometimes I'll talk to them about being an inclusive school. And very often people in those schools will say, we're not an inclusive school. We're trying to be, we're moving in that direction, but we still have new children come along that make us have to think again. So the idea is that inclusion is a process, a journey. Logically, therefore, it probably is the case. I don't want to be depressing, but it is the case. We will never have an inclusive school. It's an impossible dream, if you will, because there'll always be new children, new young people who come along who have new challenges that we have to address. So that's the first thing I want to say about it. It's a process. It's about identifying and removing barriers. Now, the word barriers, which gets mentioned a lot in the international literature, including Sustainable Development Goal 4, is quite crucial to my understanding of inclusion. And I need to just explain what I mean by barriers. You see, the curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The assessment systems we use for celebrating progress can be a barrier if they don't celebrate the progress of those children who are making relatively slow progress. And of course, our teaching methods can be a barrier if we're not able to design and orchestrate, organize a classroom where all children can feel that they are valued and can take part. Some of the most difficult barriers, of course, difficult to identify and difficult to move, are the barriers in our mind. If we don't really believe that it's possible to create a school and a classroom where all children can participate and learn, then of course it's unlikely we will make progress. Now here's the key issue in all of this, which I invite you to think about. I am not talking about barriers within children. I am not talking about barriers within families. Of course, I recognize there are difficulties in the real world, but for the purposes of bringing about change, I am talking about contextual barriers. What are the things that go on in a school or in an education system that need to be identified and addressed in order to create a more welcoming environment for all children? So that's my understanding of barriers. And I think within the field, that can be quite challenging to many people, certainly people that I meet. Then I think tactically, it's quite useful to think about inclusion, the journey, the process, in terms of three broad stages. It's about presence, being there in the school, being there in the classroom. But of course, you can be present and you might be ignored and overlooked. Your voice might not be heard. You're almost invisible in the school. So
Paula,
presence is
por
essential.
isso a presença é essencial, mas é
So the
insuficiente.
next stage is participation.
Así que la siguiente fase es
Not
la
only are you
participación.
present, but you are
No
taking
solo estás
part.
presente,
You're joining
presenti,
in.
ma si
You're
deve
welcome.
prendere parte a
You're
quello che si
recognized.
fa, si
Your
deve
name
essere
is used. So you're seen as being a significant member of the school and the class community. But even that's insufficient because you can be present and participating, and you might not be learning anything that's useful to you. So the ultimate goal of inclusion, as far as I'm concerned, the nirvana, if you will, is achievement. It's about the achievement of all students. Now, why this is so crucial, and it'd be crucial in terms of when I say a little about Portugal in a moment, the implication of this is that this is about school improvement. School improvement with attitude, if you like. School improvement based on the sort of principles I mentioned earlier. Every learner matters and matters equally. So this is not a separate project to the overall project of educational improvement, school development. It is the project as far as I'm concerned. And therefore, for me, inclusion is about all students. It's about all students. And I say that in a very practical way because in some of the schools I work with here in the UK, for example, sometimes teachers, as a result of the research they're doing with our help, will identify some children who are invisible. These, particularly in the secondary schools, often girls. They're not on any list. They're not seen as vulnerable. They come to school every day. But when you talk to them, they say, nobody seems to know who I am. The teachers don't know my name. When I put my hand up, nobody asks me to respond. So this is why my focus is on all students. But of course, history teaches us that some groups are more at risk than others. And so I think we have a moral duty to keep an eye on those. But we again have to be cautious about that. Who are the most at-risk students? They vary from place to place. In various parts of Africa, for example, it's often the girls who are most vulnerable, particularly when they get to the ages of 11 or 12, when they're working at home, or maybe they're even getting married. In my country, in England, the most vulnerable students, statistically, are white working class boys living in very poor homes, usually on public housing estates. They're the ones that underperform. They're the ones that often become excluded from school. So what I'm saying is, we do need to keep an eye on the at-risk groups, but we have to keep our eyes open for others who may be vulnerable. So that's my version of inclusion, and there are many versions, and that's part of the problem. If we can't agree what we're trying to achieve, how will we make progress? So let's turn to Portugal. In 2021-22, I was part of a group that was invited by the OECD to do a review of inclusive education. And this review was carried out partly at the invitation of the Portuguese government. It was during the period just as COVID was finishing, so it was quite difficult, and some of our research was done online. We did a lot of interviewing, but then we were able to spend time in Portugal, and we visited schools in different parts of the country. So obviously, as I was taking part in this work, I was kind of learning more about things I'd already learnt since my involvement starting in 1995. Now, I think for me, the most crucial lesson that I take for Portugal, and it links to what I've already said, that the reason they seem to have made a lot of progress over quite a lot of years, and that's to be underlined, I think, is that inclusion is not seen as a policy. It's not seen as a policy. It's seen as a principle that guides all policy. You see, if you decide to make inclusion a policy, it becomes somebody's job. This person or this group are set up to guide the policy of inclusion. But I'm describing inclusion as a principle that has to inform all policies. Therefore, it has to be everybody's job. Now, I think in terms of what's happened in Portugal, that's been made pretty clear going back quite a few years through the legislation, and I think through the kind of implementation of that legislation in policy. So that's a key factor for me. And sometimes, as I do in different parts of the world, I get to meet with policymakers. I say to them, don't have a policy for inclusion. And I can see them kind of flinch when I say that. And I say, don't have a policy. Make it a principle. A principle that informs the curriculum, that informs the assessment system, that informs the budget, that informs teacher education, and so on and so forth. It's a principle. So inclusion has to permeate everything within a system. Now, of all the places I've been in the world, and it's a fair number, I have to say, Portugal is the one, in my view, that has made most progress in relation to that idea. And that's the crucial thing from Portugal. But then there are some practical things that have come out from it. Of course, I'd want to say from my involvement in Portugal, particularly in the OECD study, one became aware, understandably, that there is variation across the country, as there will be in any country. There's variation, some good, some bad, some not so good, you know? And so these lessons I'm drawing, I'm not saying for 1 minute they're there in every school and every district of Portugal, but I've seen enough good examples to know that they are important factors in moving a system forward. The first thing is about leadership, and clearly leadership is crucial to all of this. Now, the striking thing about leadership in Portugal is how democratically it is organised. So, for example, the school directors, the school principals, in England we would call them head teachers, they are elected by representatives of the community, including families, and they're elected for 4 years. And they might be elected for another 4 years, and then that's finished. So those people who become the directors of the school are very much answerable to the community. I remember in one school, I said to the school director, I said to him, who are you accountable to? And he had very good English, but he clearly didn't know what I meant. And I said, who are you accountable? And he thought for a few minutes and he said, the committee who'd answered him. So here, I mean, this is very different, certainly to my country, where we certainly don't have the election of what we call head teachers. So the dynamics of the school, I think, to some extent, are created by all of that. And again, I'm not saying that always works perfectly. And I can remember thinking over many years that in some ways this can be a kind of barrier to progress. Because if you know you're going to have to be re-elected after 4 years, possibly as a leader, you won't necessarily want to make too many changes. You won't want to disturb too many people. But nevertheless, from our observations and talking with people in the school, the sense of that democratic appointment seems to be an important factor in all of this. Another factor that I've seen in various parts of Portugal is the way in which evidence is used to stimulate professional development and indeed school development. Now, when I say evidence, I mean different kind of things. Of course, it often starts with statistics, and statistics are a very good starting point. But of course, research methodologists will tell you every method has its strength, every method has its weakness. Statistics are very good at showing you what things look like, but they don't tell you why. So if you want to change things, you want to develop your school community, as well as statistics, you need qualitative evidence. Particularly, you need to hear voices, the voices of teachers, the voices of students, the voices of families. Now, in the best examples that I've seen in Portugal, and indeed in other places, it's that kind of inquiry-based professional development stimulated by an engagement with evidence that brings people together to say, what can we do here? Particularly for those children who we're not reaching at the moment. So it creates a kind of dynamic of development based on evidence. Linked to that, the best practice that I've seen in Portugal, and again, elsewhere, is very much about partnerships, cooperation. All schools in Portugal are in cluster groups, local groupings. Some are small, some are slightly bigger, but they're area-based clusters. And in my view, this is a very powerful means of providing the kind of mutual support that you need to move schools in an inclusive direction. And there's evidence that my colleagues and I have collected from various parts of the world, again, here in the UK as well, to show that these kind of area partnerships, when they work, and they don't always work, when they work, they're a good means of supporting the individual school. Now, what's happened in Portugal is gradually, as the separate special provision was closed down and the children and the adults were integrated into the clusters, then, of course, within the partnerships, there are the children, there are the teachers, there are the families, but there are also quite a lot of experts, educational psychologists, speech therapists, people with a background in special education, but they're no longer separate. They're there as part of what goes on in the school. And they create teams so that particularly where there's a concern about a particular child, the team will meet together to discuss what they know about the child and what needs to happen. So when this works well, what this is creating is a kind of problem-solving organization where people come together to share ideas within the school and then in the cluster between the schools. I'm absolutely convinced that this is crucial. I think more could be done in Portugal on this issue, and in our report we make reference to that. But there's plenty of good examples of it. And I think one of the recommendations we made in the report is that more effort needs to be made to move expertise around within the country. We interviewed some people who were doing fantastic things, but we were not convinced that their experiences, their expertise, their ideas was being shared. So one of the things I think we recommended was that more needs to be done to encourage more of this collaboration within the partnerships, but between the partnerships. Some of it goes on, but I think more of it could happen. Then there's the whole role of the wider community. I've said already about their involvement in the appointment of the director. In the best examples that we saw, the involvement, particularly of families, of course, but also other groups in the community, local businesses, universities, faith church organizations. All of these, I think, can also make a contribution. And there are excellent examples in Portugal. And that's another example of where I think more could be done to celebrate those examples, but also share them around so that other parts of the country can deal with each other. One of the things that we recommended in the report was that perhaps more needs to be done, particularly at the kind of regional level, to make these links between different activities going on, but it could also happen at the national level. And so, in terms of going back to policy, I think what seems to have been very successful in Portugal is that through the legislation that's been carried out over the last 20 years, it's created spaces for local action. It's created a stimulus for local action. And of course, it's created those principles, these key ideas that everybody can work together. And I think that's a crucial area that needs to be built upon. I often say this is about the collective will to make it happen. In places that make progress, of course, it's about ideas, about practical suggestions, but more than anything else, it's a social process. People coming together and saying, we want the best for our children and we're going to make it happen. And of course, takes you back to the issue of leadership. So that's my sort of final point, really. The most important lesson I think I take from Portugal is this progress they've made in terms of creating a collective will to make it happen. In terms of the next stages, and Portuguese colleagues will be more up to date than I am with this, there are clearly still big challenges in Portugal. The link between economic disadvantage and outcomes is still there, as it is in every European country. And despite the progress that's made, that I think is something that still needs to be addressed. There is variation across the country. There's no doubt about that. In some parts of the country, they've made more progress than others, which supports the argument that there needs to be more moving of knowledge around across the country and across the particular areas of the country. Particular groups that remain vulnerable, I am told by Portuguese colleagues, is a considerable worries about the Roma community. And we spoke to some of the representatives of the Roma community, and they clearly are a resource and want to support the government and practitioners in moving things forward. But they have traditionally been a marginalised group and remain so. So that group, and then there's a whole issue of people coming from other countries. And like other European countries, Portugal gets a lot of immigration, including, of course, quite a lot of families who already speak Portuguese, which is a bit of an advantage if they've already got the language. This thing about diversity, I think, is an important issue that we need to think about as well in terms of how this is conceptualized. See, I live and work most of the time in the city of Manchester. So it was the first industrial city in the north of England. And somebody did some research a few years back, and they worked out that something like 150 languages are spoken amongst the children in Manchester School. 150 languages. 60% of the children are bilingual. They speak one language at home with their parents, and they speak English in the schools. Now, for many years, that was seen as an enormous problem. And of course, it still can be a problem. But what's happened is, as the system has matured in its capacity to engage with differences, gradually those differences of language, culture, religion have become a stimulus to innovation. And I'm rightly proud of the city schools, and it's true of other schools in cities in England, London, Birmingham, Leeds, in those very diverse communities. As we have learned how to live with differences and learn from differences, it's stimulated innovation and development. So I think the collective will to make it happen includes the collective will to learn from differences. As was said at the beginning by Diana, all of this is written in more details in this book that was published last year and is now available through Narcia in Spanish. In the book, late on in the book, I think it's in the final chapter, I have a section particularly on Portugal, and I develop the arguments I've heard before. And because it's a country I know very well and work with, I also compare Portugal with the Netherlands. Both relatively small countries, reasonably well developed, but very different education systems. In the Netherlands, it's well resourced, teachers are well paid, people are very enthusiastic, but it's very fragmented and segregated system. They have a very large proportion, relatively large proportion of their learners in separate provision compared with many other parts of Europe. So here's a country that's invested in education, there's no doubt about it, a very pro-education community, but somehow they've gone down the road of segregation and dealing with difference in that way. In the book, I contrast that with Portugal, where clearly they've learned to learn from differences, and I think that's what's taken them forward. Welcome comments and questions, Diana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mel, for that really, really interesting overview, and you gave us in the introduction, and then your particular focus on Portugal, drawing out the ways in which Portugal really has played with strengths and developed strengths and expertise, and how other countries may look to that for some examples. But obviously, as you said right at the beginning, things are not directly transferable, but there's plenty of opportunity to learn. That's so interesting. Thank you so much. So I would like to, anybody who has a question, please, to if they can put that question in the Q&A feature, please enter it in any language of the 3 languages, and we will translate for you. If you would like to. I'm sure that's raised so many issues for us. I know that amongst the participants here, we have stakeholders from the 3 countries, but also people who are practitioners in schools, working in support, regional leaders, national decision makers, and so on. So there is a wide variety of people. And I know you've raised some interesting points that I'm sure people would like to develop. So I just asking my colleagues if there are any questions that I haven't seen that anybody has put up.
Or comments, perhaps, Diana.
Or indeed comments, yes, please. And please come back. I'm sure Mel will be very open to comments or clarifications or any of these things. And Mel, I would just like to ask you, while we're waiting to see if people would like to put any questions up, we're talking about collective will, and perhaps I think you also expressed it slightly different, but changing people's attitudes and mindsets is possibly one of the greatest things there is to overcome in making progress in inclusive education. Can you say any more about how countries who, and recently we're seeing governments moving in a different direction away from inclusive education and so on, and you talked about the Netherlands having a more segregated system, and perhaps a lot of people work on, academic selection and these kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about how we might, or countries might, address the issue of changing, developing the will to make changes? Yeah. How can we work with a collective to develop a collective will?
It's a really key question. And of course, it doesn't lend itself to glib, quick answers, because there aren't any glib answers. And as I said early on, place matters, and the context matters in all of this. I mean, clearly this is about the format of national education. What kind of national education do we want in each of our communities? And clearly there has been this great commitment over 20 years in Portugal, and wherever we went, the mantra which we kept hearing in one form or another was, you don't have to label to intervene. And I heard the minister say that, and I heard some parents say it, and of course I heard a lot of teachers and head school directors say, you don't have to label to intervene. Now, clearly they've been working on that principle for 20 years, and they seem to have taken, I mean, not everybody, of course, but they clearly have taken the community forward. So you're left thinking, well, what is the driving argument in each of our countries? And here's where I can get slightly depressed, really, because I'll talk about my country, England, and I mean, the worry about England is it had an enormous impact on educational policymakers across the world. Some good things, but some things which, frankly, are not very helpful in what we're talking about. See, the principle of the English education system is one of using competition, and I'm using politicians' words now, using competition to drive up standards. And that terminology has been around for 20 years or more through successive governments of different political persuasions, using difference to drive up standards. Now, if you think about competition, there's a logic there which helps us to think about each of our own places. If you have lots of competition, as we have in England, competition between schools to attract children, competition between teachers, competition between children, and so on. If you have competition, what do you get? You get winners. And how do you get winners? By creating losers. So sadly, in my education system here in England, and there are many people who are fighting it, the truth is the system is designed to create losers. And another feature of the English education system, which has been very influential, is the emphasis on outcomes. Now, how outcomes are determined is a crucial factor. And in England, we have regular testing of children on a very narrow range of outcomes. Of course, again, you put the two things together, competition and testing on narrow outcomes, you're, again, going to get some children who are predictably going to be seen as failures. And of course, what happens to those children, or some of them, they get labelled. And when they get labelled, they get separated, either into the corner or in the corridor or in another class, or indeed to a separate special school. So the way national policies shape attitudes within a country is crucial. And again, as I say, that's why I think there's so much encouragement from what happens in Portugal. The drivers for this, I think, goes back to something I've said. It's about the principles upon which an education system attempts to move forward. What is the key vision for the country? But then the other driver is how evidence is used to monitor that vision. Now, again, England is an extreme case from which we can learn. We've fallen into a trap, in my view, in England. We've learnt to value what you can measure. Now, some things are relatively easy to measure, easy to be tested, easy to be noticed during school inspection, and school inspection, in my view, is quite crucial. So what we've got is a system which values what can be measured. But there's a lesson in that we can turn to advantage. And I think it's there in Portugal. If we say it the other way around, if we learn to measure what we value. In other words, in my terms, what I'd want to see would be a country measuring presence, which children are here, which children are in the school, which children are missing, participation, and that's much more difficult to measure because you've got to listen to the voice of children themselves. And I'm convinced that the voice of children is an absolutely massive lever for change if we learn how to do it. You see, we talked to many children in Portugal during that 2 years. And I mean, many of them articulated the idea of inclusion. They were proud of it. They talked about how wonderful it was to be in the classroom with children from different parts of the world. They were proud of being in an inclusive school community. So the idea had seeped through to them as well, really. So it's measuring presence, participation, and of course it's measuring achievement. But achievement, in my view, on a broad range of outcomes, not just the sort of narrow testing, which is the feature, sadly, of my country. So what this becomes, as I've stressed throughout this talk, really, is this is about core business. This is about how you design your education system. It's about politics, of course, political decision making, and it requires that, well, that cliche I've used, the collective will to make it happen. But spending time in Portugal makes you think it's possible. We know it's possible. And there are other countries I've been to where I've seen, very encouraging. I was in Norway not so long ago, and I sensed a very inclusive spirit. I spent time in Italy in the autumn last year, and of course, Italy has made a lot of progress in all that sense. But I felt that in Italy, the remnants of special education thinking is still deep in the system there. And so you end up, they've got lots of teaching assistants and support staff, which you need, and they're excellent. But the danger is they become a strategy for segregation rather than a strategy for creating a more inclusive learning environment. It's complex stuff, there's no doubt.
Thank you very much indeed for that very comprehensive answer. I have a question here that comes from Spain, and you mentioned briefly some regional disparities and so on, and of course that's part of this project. But this question specifically says, are regional alliances enhanced from the administration, brackets, educational leaders, in some way, or do they arise from the educational centres themselves?
Yeah.
Does that make sense in this
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Because again, over the years, I've spent a lot of time in Spain. I love being in Spain. This is a wonderful country, and of course, I was in Murcia about 3 weeks ago. Spain is very much divided into the different provinces, and of course, they are very different. In some cases, linguistically different. So if you think about Catalonia, País Vasco, they actually have different languages, you know, and so the complexity of educational change in a country like Spain, a massive country as well, you add to that complexity that you can have national policy, but then it's really what happens at the provincial level that is crucial. And yeah, it's a good example of why we have to be respectful of local history and local traditions and so on. And I mean, I'm not up to date with Spain really, but when I used to spend a lot of time there at one time, there were clearly disparities, and there were certain parts of the country that were really making very good progress. But in some parts of Spain, of course, it's still highly segregated. And there is a big sort of voice for retaining and protecting special education provision in Spain, which has a very powerful political presence in government.
Do you think that I think this question also is around when you have autonomous communities, for example, in Spain, is it possible, do you think, that the communities need to talk more to each other and have, I think this person uses alliances. Is that something that could be a kind of a lever for change around addressing some of the disparities that one gets?
I think so. And in a sense, at a macro level, it echoes some of what I said about Portugal, or what we said about Portugal in that report, really, is that you need to find the best practice and you need to celebrate it and publicize it and get people to come and have a look at what we're doing in Andalusia or wherever, in Catalonia, wherever. I think that's why I think different levels of an education system have a contribution to make here. Clearly, as I've argued, governments have a key role to play in setting the agenda, in determining the principles, in keeping an eye on it, making sure it's happening. Clearly, schools individually, and then in these partnerships that I'm stressing, they have a key role to play. But the bit in the middle, you know, the middle tier, as school improvement talk about it, is crucial. You see, a lot of the international research talks about the importance of the middle tier, but the middle tier has to be constructed differently in different places. It looks different in different places. But I think there has to be that kind of localized coordinating arrangement, I think.
Thank you. Yes, and I think this is a comment rather than a question from someone in Portugal. I'll read this out to you because I think this is providing an example of what you've really just said. The person has put, as an art teacher in Portugal, I consider myself quite supported by legislation and by having colleagues with specific training in special education, I think that is. There is even a teaching group that provides support to students and teachers, in essence, since the logistics for acquiring knowledge and facilitating. Whether I think there may be a word have been missed off the end, but I think that is that they are, the person is saying that maybe it's an example, there's a teaching group that includes students, sort of learners and teachers, which is very much in line with what you're saying about voice. I think this is perhaps an example of how teachers can learn from what children are telling us.
Yes, a lot of our work over quite a few years now, I mainly work with schools, but I also work with governments occasionally. But a lot of our work has been around, you know, what kind of evidence can stimulate inclusive development. And I mean, there are all sorts of evidence, as I've said, statistics. Teachers have to see each other working, you know. It's still the case in many schools that I go to. Teachers never see anybody else work. And of course, it's a very demanding day. There's no time to talk. You're in the classroom with the door closed. And often when I get the chance, I watch teachers working and I sit down with them after the lesson and I say, this is what I've seen during the last hour. I said, and I'm not an inspector. This is not performance management. I'm trying to learn from you. And I go through my notes and I said, I saw you do this. I heard the children say that. And when I do that, particularly with very experienced teachers, they express surprise. And they say, did I do that? I don't remember doing that. And what it reminds us, I say us, people like me who live in the kind of twilight zone of the education system, how intensive the day of a teacher is. There is no time to think. There is no time to talk about what you do. You're too busy doing it. You have your plan, but there are 30 other plans in the room. And if you don't link your plan to those plans, you're in difficulty. So teachers are great improvisers. They think on their feet. That's why teachers are so tired. People who are not teachers don't understand it. Why are they tired? They have this wonderful job. They have, a short day, long holidays. They're surrounded by all these happy, smiling children, and they're tired. Well, I know why they're tired. I was a teacher a long time ago. I know why they're tired. They're physically tired. They're on their feet all the time. They're emotionally tired. They're being drained. I'm talking about the senior leadership team, and most importantly, they're intellectually tired. They don't have time to think about what they're doing because they're too busy doing it. Now, when we see progress, I say we because I do nothing on my own. When we see progress in schools, there is a deliberate attempt to break that down. So teachers have a chance just occasionally to see one another working. They collect other evidence, particularly the views of children and young people, that stimulate their thinking. And of course, none of this happens by chance. Brings you back to the issue of leadership. You see, sometimes when I say that to school directors in England, for example, I say, if your teachers don't have a chance to see one another working, you're not getting the best out of the workforce. And somebody will say, well, I agree with you, Mel, but the trouble is there isn't time. And I say, well, then you don't agree with me. Time is the currency in schools that we use to signal that something's important. If you believe, as I do, that investing in the learning of your staff, your adults, will improve the learning of children, you will find time. There is no time, but you will find it. And those are the sort of features, and I go into more detail in this about the book. Sorry to be a bit promotional, but in the book I give many examples of this kind of thing, of schools that made progress by investing in the professional development of the teachers and creating the kind of atmosphere and the time where people can talk about practice and share ideas so they become more articulate about their practice. Now, we saw examples of that in Portugal, but as we recommended in the report, I think the next stage needs more investment in that in Portugal, more investment in professional learning, not going on courses. I'm not opposed to that, but that's not the cake. The cake is really, that's the cream on the cake, if you will. The cake is professional learning in the school. Teachers seeing one another working, teachers hearing the voice of children, teachers sitting down as groups and thinking about how else can we make a lesson where all children can be included. So it's school improvement and it's professional development led within the school community. And as I say, I think that would be something that I'd hope to see more of in Portugal. We saw some good examples, no doubt. And of course, the clusters are a gift, really, because you can then do that not just within your own school, but you can do it across the schools in your partnership. And we've got lots of international research to show that those kind of partnerships, networks, whatever you want to call them, can be a very powerful means of professional development.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been absolutely fascinating and so informative, Mel. Thank you so much. Maybe people will come back later on at the end with more questions.
I'll keep an eye on the chat as well.
Okay, thank you so much. And I would like now to introduce our next speaker, if I may. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Symeonidou. And Simoni is an associate
just
professor.
A minute, because the lights just went down, so I need to get back to you.
Oh dear, sorry, Simoni. I will just continue with Simoni's biography, if I may. Let's hope the light situation sorts out. Technology is always conspiring against us, I think, at these things. So anyway, Simoni is an associate professor in inclusive education at the Department of Education in the University of Cyprus. Simoni, you're back. That's brilliant. I've just done one line of your bio. Just introducing you. Thank you. Is all well with your lights? Is it okay?
Yes. It's just that the last person who leaves the building switched off the lights and they didn't know I was in my office. So
oh dear. I'm glad you'll be all right. So Simoni's research interests include teacher education for inclusive education, curriculum development for inclusive education, anti-oppressive curriculum development, inclusive education policy and practice, disability politics, and disability research. So extremely wide-ranging, as you can see. She's actively involved in networks, as we've just been talking about, and local and European associations promoting inclusive educational issues. At the same time, Simoni also coordinates inclusive education modules for primary and pre-primary student teachers and provides a wide range of continuing professional development opportunities. So, Simoni, it's wonderful that you can be here and join us today. I know it's much later in the day for you, so thank you very much also for that. And we're very much looking forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for the introduction and for inviting me. And I'm really glad to be here with you today. And also, I'm also glad for listening to Mel Ainscow's presentation to start this webinar, because there are so many links with my presentation as well. So I think, and also Paula's examples, I think will give a more complete idea about resource allocation to the people who participate in this webinar today. So I try to provide more information about how we can make the most of financial and human resources for inclusive education. So I'll begin with explaining briefly what is inclusive education in principle that Mel Ainscow did so well. So I'll just add a little bit to this discussion that he started. And then I will discuss briefly how the decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that countries are asked to make as far as their policy is concerned. And then I will talk about financial resources, human resources, and I'll finish with the conclusion. So I chose to start by making this statement that inclusive education is about all children, because it seems that it's still not clear to teachers and to different countries' policymakers because of the history of how the concept developed. Indeed, inclusive education is about access, presence, as Mel said before, participation, but not in statistical terms, in meaningful participation, collaboration, and progress for all children. Another important principle is that all children have intersectional identities when we discuss about inclusive education. So we should not think of children's one identity and try to provide support around this identity, but rather realize that they have intersectional identities and the education system needs to consider them all. Of course, children at risk of exclusion will be benefited from inclusive education systems, and that's why we're trying to develop the systems and make them more inclusive, because everybody will be benefited, including children at risk of exclusion. So decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that need to be made. It's the whole policy framework that countries develop and follow. And sometimes, as we already heard, we have inclusive education policies that might not serve inclusion because these are followed by other scattered policies about different aspects of the education system that don't follow the inclusive education principle. It's also linked with the decisions that countries make about the national curricula. And there's this discussion among countries and among teachers whether it is more appropriate to have common curriculum for all or a special curriculum for different groups of children. Even if we have a common curriculum, that doesn't mean that it's an inclusive one. So inclusive curricula need to be adaptable, flexible, and correspond to all learners' profiles. Standardization is also a barrier to inclusive education. The fact that support is based on diagnosis in many countries is also a barrier, and it's something that most countries learn to work with this principle, and put all their sources in special education or in following a child. Parallel systems of special and mainstream education have been there in many countries, embedded in teachers' understanding of how education should be designed and implemented. And also the inclusive education rhetoric that is adapted by policymakers or in policies. But sometimes it describes segregating approaches. So it's not always clear that when we talk about inclusive education or when this is mentioned in policies, that everybody understands what inclusive education is about. Sometimes it's another name for segregation and integration. So having a focus on financial resources for inclusive education, it seems that even though funding and resourcing inclusive education is critically important for our countries, it's massively neglected in the literature of inclusive education. There are not many sources there, although there are some very interesting studies. It's not a very well-researched topic, we would say. We also have to face the challenge that the move towards inclusive education is done by many countries that turn towards inclusive education, as we heard earlier, but the allocation of financial resources remains unchanged. So even though policies change, commitments change, the financial resources are more reluctant to change. So we have a paradox. Inclusive education policies, or at least termed that they are inclusive, but also the increasing need to label the learners in order to secure funding. This is not very helpful if we want to commit to inclusive education. Looking into the literature, we can realize that there is a variation of funding models within and across many countries, and there is a variation in approaches across provinces and territories of the same country. So funding systems are not always, clear or the same everywhere, even in the same country. According to Banks and his colleagues, there are some predominant resource allocation models, and I will elaborate on those. It's the input funding model, the throughput funding model, and the output funding model. So according to Meher and Watkins, who also worked for the European Agency, when we talk about input funding model, we understand that funding is based on some aspect of identified need, such as the types or categories of needs learners may have, or the number of learners with special needs in a school, municipality, or region. So inputs may also be defined in terms of referral rates, low achievement scores, the number of disadvantaged pupils, and so on. But the key point in that funding is based on the expressed or measured needs. So we understand that this model is closer to an integration approach rather than an inclusive one. When it comes to throughput funding model, funding is based on the functions or tasks that have to be undertaken or developed. So finances are allocated on the condition that particular services will be developed or maintained by a school, municipality, or region. Of course, certain output conditions can be included in this model, but funding itself is not based on outputs or inputs. In this model, governance and accountability can play an important role. So this model might be closer to inclusive education on the one hand, but it still has its drawbacks that we'll discuss in a minute. And it's also the output funding model, which is which means that part of the funding depends on the learning results obtained by students. And we talked about standardized tests already. Learners' progress is measured through these tests, and funding follows schools according to the findings and to the results that children have in standardized tests. There are some important studies from the European Agency on financing inclusive education. Of course, now there they can be a bit outdated, but these are the only studies we have. The one in 1991 particularly investigated resourcing special needs education, and the one in 2016, inclusive education. So the conclusions from these studies that examined the funding systems in some of the countries who are members of the European agency were that where we have input funding model, it seems that the labeling of learners is prioritized. So support relates to the need for an official decision. Another limitation of the input funding model is that special schools are not encouraged to take the role of resource centers, which is they are expected to do in inclusive education systems. So funds are allocated to special schools based on the number of learners enrolled. If we go for a throughput funding model, this may lead to inactivity and inertia since funds are generally available. So there is no need for labeling, which is a good thing. But then there are funds there, and it's very easy not to control or understand how these are allocated for inclusive education. So the European agency concludes that governance and accountability mechanisms are necessary. And then the achievement of a balance between input and throughput approaches is necessary. So it's not just one model, but it's how models are combined to serve the interests of learners in inclusive education systems. There's another study that comes from Banks and his colleagues, which is a comparative one, and compares the systems of Ireland, Norway, and Italy. And as you can see in this table, which is from the paper, the authors conclude that funding structures are strictly intertwined with conceptualizations of inclusive education policy. So in the upper part of this table, you can see a very brief description of the country's policies. Of course, in the paper, they are more detailed. But as we see Ireland here, inclusive education represents one way, together with special schools and classes, to respond to special educational needs. It is discussed in terms of effectiveness of students' learning outcomes. The funding model in this system is mixed. So it combines output, throughput, and input model. In Norway, inclusive education is understood in terms of a strategy for contributing to equality in society. It comprehends the idea that adapted education responds to those that do not benefit from ordinary education. It has been long conceived in opposition to special education, while recently special education tends to be perceived as part of inclusive education. According to the authors, in Norway, there is no specific funding for inclusion or special education, only funding for general education. And schools are autonomous for funding on school level, and the same applies for Ireland. In Italy, a contradiction exists between a general education system sensitive to equity and differences on one side, and inclusive education understood as the right of some students to get personal obstacles for food development and participation compensated on the other. So input model based on a category-based medical understanding of special educational needs is applied. National funding rules are common to all schools. And I quote the authors here who say that inclusive funding structures and models cannot be explored, developed, or reformed in an isolated manner because their understanding is strictly interconnected with a more general understanding of inclusion and equity in education. So we need to see all this, the commitment to inclusion, how inclusive education is understood, is interlinked with how the countries develop their policies. Another study which is relevant to how resource allocation is approached in the different countries is the one that explores the narratives of funding related to inclusive education in Canadian news media. This is an interesting study because it explored many publications in the media. And it seems that the authors come to the conclusion that media articles support the need for increased funding for inclusive education using needs-based arguments. And as you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side of the paper, the circles around the central circle there describe the topics that the mass media news were concerned with. And it seems that the trade unions, the governments, and political parties highlight different aspects that have to do with the provisions, the specialist provision and funding specialist provision, to highlight needs-based arguments. For example, a political party used based on labels arguments to require for more funding for children with autism in the autistic spectrum disorder. Also, trade unions usually require for more specialist teachers or more educational assistants with the argument that teachers can't do it all. So it seems that there is a spiral narrative that situates complex classrooms and needy students at the core, and a range of funded supports are believed to be necessary to varying degrees for these students to be effectively included. But will inclusive education be implemented if more funds are allocated? Is this what is really needed to have inclusive education? So Thompson et al. And the colleagues use these two approaches to explain the difference. There's the relocation approach to inclusive education, which represents the idea that more services and supports are needed, more educational assistance, more specialists, and so on. But on the other hand, there is transformative approach to inclusive education, which is the idea that learners' inclusion is linked with teachers' approaches of differentiated teaching and assessment. And we'll refer to differentiated teaching in a bit. So governments, teacher unions, parents, political parties may have their own interests served by ascribing to the relocation approach of inclusive education, whereas we should consider a transformative approach more. Let's turn now to the human resources for inclusive education. And let me begin by saying that all school staff needs to be prepared for inclusive education. Of course, it's teachers, school leaders, assistants, and any other staff that is based at school, and also staff that is involved in education in other ways. For example, staff that prepares materials for education, or staff that hires people that will work in school. So they should all be prepared for inclusive education. They should all understand the same thing. From the literature, we know that teachers tend to feel unprepared for inclusive education, and this is the case in many countries. And I quote Florian here, who says that deeper consideration needs to be given to the power of the belief that teachers hold about human ability, teaching, learning, and specialist knowledge. Teachers in many countries, mainstream teachers, I mean, have learned that specialists know better. They are not, they don't believe in their own studies. They don't think that all children can learn, and they don't think that they can teach all children, whereas they could if they were empowered to. Also, mainstream and special teachers feel that they have distinct roles. So there's a criticism of the ideological orientation of separate initial teacher education programs that create either general or special teachers. And many countries still have these separate tracks in initial teacher education at a time where we're trying to bring specialist teachers and mainstream teachers closer. So this is not helpful if we want to engage in the process for inclusive education. Another important aspect is teacher professional learning. And by teacher professional learning, we mean all the whole career path of teachers, beginning from student teachers in initial teacher education, beginning teachers, those who just enter schools, experienced teachers, and teacher educators. And by teacher educators, we mean school leaders who can be teacher educators in their schools, and also teacher educators in higher education institutions. It seems that one important gap is in this path is recorded in many countries. So in many cases, initial teacher education functions independently, is not linked to the policy for continuing professional development. In some countries, the induction phase is missing. So not everybody in their career paths are committed in inclusive education, in the principle of inclusive education. In addition, from a review of the literature, we know that special education approaches are still present in various teacher professional learning opportunities. So how can we expect teachers to commit to inclusive education if we don't ensure that all teacher professional learning opportunities are shaped around the principle of inclusive education? So it's necessary to consider how to bridge the gaps in the teacher professional learning career paths, to provide interconnected teacher professional learning opportunities for school staff, to provide school-based professional learning approaches, which encourages links between schools and university. And I call Ainscow here, and he also referred to this in his presentation earlier. It's very important for teacher professional learning to be school-based and for the teachers to know that they have support in engaging in this new way of working. And also avoid superficial approaches in teacher professional learning. And I'm referring here to one-off seminars. Let's talk about inclusion today, or let's talk about differentiation. And then we are not able to know what the teachers learned from this seminar, how they are going to implement differentiation without any support. So it's just TPL activities that have no impact. And this is not helpful if we want to invest in our human resources for inclusive education. Another way to maximize our human resources for inclusive education is to invest on co-teaching. And I'm not talking here about any kind of co-teaching, because in many countries advertise is not a very good word, but they demonstrate in their documents, or they describe co-teaching approaches in their effort to promote inclusive education. However, the different models that we see in some countries not always promote inclusive education. So again, as inclusive education needs to be understood, we need to understand what we mean by co-teaching for inclusive education. Co-teachers' profiles may vary, but this should be seen as a strength, and teacher professional learning on co-teaching should take these different profiles into consideration. The mainstream and special teachers' traditional roles and duties should be seen in a different way now if we want to move towards inclusive education, but this is not easy for the professionals who are engaged. So TPL for co-teaching is needed, and we need to promote collaboration of teachers throughout the process, before, during, and after teaching, not just in-class collaboration or in-class presence of two teachers, but before, in the planning phase, during teaching, and after teaching for feedback, for review, and then for the preparation for the next course, for the next teaching. Of course, there are barriers for this to be achieved, and there should be ways to move towards to increase co-teaching for inclusive education gradually, because there is more time needed and perhaps more resources. But this should be a more targeted approach to invest on human resources for inclusive education. There are also some studies in the literature that approach co-teaching as a resource for inclusive education. For example, one study here by Simoni and colleagues found that job-embedded professional development in Florida increased mainstream and special teachers' engagement in teaching. But in this case, teachers were provided training on school level. It was ongoing, so it could have this impact. And also another study in Germany, where special and mainstream teachers highlight the need for external resources, such as time and equipment, but at the same time, they suggest that there is a need to develop a shared responsibility for inclusive schooling. So it's resources on one hand, but the shared responsibility is at equal terms, and this came from mainstream and special teachers. And moving towards the end, differentiation and universal design for learning should be also something to invest about and invest on. And we see many times in policies that these strategies are mentioned, maybe in the curricula or in policies. But on the other hand, if curricula and policies are not developed in ways that encourage them, they remain just words and wishful thinking for teachers to implement on their own. And of course, it was already mentioned that teachers are on the spot every day trying to manage so many things. So they need to be supported through policies and curricula to develop differentiated teaching and to adapt UDL approaches. So when it comes to differentiation, of course, by Carol Ann Tomlinson, the definition is that the content, process, outcome, and environment needs to be differentiated, considering children's different readiness levels, interests, and learning profiles. But teachers' misconceptions and fear about differentiation are documented in the literature. So if countries just ask the teachers to differentiate, it's most probable that they won't, because they don't really understand what differentiation is about unless they have appropriate TPL opportunities on this. And there are also systemic barriers to differentiation. So if policies or curricula require teachers to differentiate, but at the same time they favor a standardized assessment, then the whole chain and the whole process breaks somewhere, and we can't see the effect of differentiation because some students will fail in the standardized tests. So the curriculum is a starting point here, and we're going back to the slides I showed at the beginning, that there are so many interconnected aspects in moving towards more inclusive education system. We need to have a curriculum that really promotes inclusive education, not just in rhetoric, but in the ways it's structured. We also need to have common understanding of differentiation. For example, the ministries of education and also pedagogical agencies that collaborate with ministries and the universities should have the same understanding of what differentiation is. And there are examples of countries that universities have a particular view of differentiation and teach differentiation in a particular way, according to the literature, and the ministry perceives differentiation as differentiating for one student, the student with disabilities. Again, like co-teaching, teacher professional learning for differentiation should be school-based, ongoing, and also linked to co-teaching. So again, we see another link here, how human resources can be, we can make more use of human resources. And universal design for learning, which was defined by CAST, engagement, representation, action, and expression are the three key pillars of UDL. But how can we facilitate teachers in understanding the concept, and also how policies can help them, can make it easier for them to engage in this idea? We want accessibility at different levels, at school building and classes. We can't expect teachers to organize learning and also try to overcome different barriers to make their classes more accessible. For example, chairs and desks can be a barrier from some children. So if we don't have this in place, then how can we ask teachers to move on and differentiate? Also, textbook developments. We know that countries may, at least in centralized systems, textbook development is undertaken by teams that may be based in the Ministry of Education or in pedagogical agencies. but are textbooks developed in ways that can reach all learners? Are they accessible, for example? Do we have educational material banks that provide texts in different modes, in easy to read, in plain text, in audio, in visual form? If we don't invest on this, then we will demand teachers to develop these materials. And this is asking too much, and of course, another barrier to inclusive education. So again, we need to, countries are required to have teacher professional learning for UDL, emphasize the use of technology and perhaps the use of AI tools, and support teachers in their efforts to teach inclusive settings. And coming now to a conclusion, how we make things happen. Commitment to inclusive education requires minimizing exclusion. We can't just say we want to turn towards inclusive education, but at the same time invest on traditional practices of exclusion. Countries need to contextualize their approaches in resource allocation for inclusive education. This webinar is very useful today because we can see, and I think the participants will have a good idea of what happens in different countries, what are the different approaches, what are the challenges there. But each country needs to contextualize human and resource allocation and make the decision based on the system they have and the vision they have to change it to the better. Decisions about the allocation of financial and human resources are linked with other decisions that can promote inclusive education. This is what I started with, and this is what I want to end the presentation with. And I finish with a quote from Hegarty on this point, who says, educational policy is a construct of many factors, and those who would influence policy must be aware of these factors and understand the interactions between them. Expert teaching, likewise, is a product of many inputs, and both teacher education and school improvement must be cognizant of that. Thank you, and I'd love to answer your questions. And I hope I was on time, Diane.
Simoni, of course you were. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. And there is just so much around resourcing, isn't there? It's immensely complex. And of course, it is involved in every single aspect of education from the top to the bottom, as it were, and across to the sides. And you've raised and brought together so many points for us to make that really clear. Thank you so much. And we can see how, all the decisions are interlinked, that you put money here and it has this consequence, and how the whole construction is like a Rubik's Cube, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And thank you for doing that. What I propose is that I'll invite Paula to speak now, and then I think after that we might have questions for both of your presentations, if that's all right. So thank you very, very much indeed for that. It was fascinating, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Paula, if I may introduce you and invite you to speak now. So for our participants, Dr. Paula Hunt is the owner and principal of DED, Disability Education and Development, LDA, which she has been an expert consultant on inclusive education with UNICEF, UNDP and UNESCO for the past 12 years. Paula is a senior technical expert on inclusive education with Inclusion International and part of the global team with the Catalyst for Inclusive Education. Paula has also provided capacity development related to inclusive education and children with disabilities in various countries, and supported the conceptualization, development and implementation of work related to inclusive education and or with for children with disabilities in various contexts and regions. She has extensive teaching experience in special and inclusive classrooms and in higher education also. So as with our other two speakers, Paula has this vast experience and richness and depth of understanding across some different aspects, and some of them, of course, the same as our other two speakers or similar. And we are absolutely delighted that you're able to be with us, Paula, and thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I trust that everybody can see my slides and can hear me well.
Oh, well, I think. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. So good afternoon, first of all. My name is Paula Hunt, and although I am Portuguese, I am not here to speak to you about Portugal. I was asked to speak to you and bring you some examples from countries that are engaging in resource allocation for inclusive education in intentional and purposeful ways to directly respond to their most immediate challenges. So I ask you that for the next 20 minutes or so, you keep an open mind and you consider how the examples that I am going to show you might bring a new light to the similar obstacles that have been found in Italy, Spain, and Portugal through the course of this project. It is always really important for me in situations such as webinars and presentations and conferences to ensure that there is actually clarity of language and that we all understand what it is that we are talking about from the very beginning. I am often told that inclusive education means many things to different people. And this way of thinking about an inclusive education definition actually allows for inclusive education to be understood as everything from meaningful systemic reform to something as simple as providing access to school to a child with a disability. So for the purposes of this presentation and really as the core of the work that I am engaged in, I am defining inclusive education by using the only definition that is legally binding. And that is the definition that is included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, General Comment number 4, paragraph 11, which states that inclusion involves a process of systemic reform embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environments that best responds to the requirements and their preferences. So even though this might not be the way in which the legislation in your country defines inclusive education, it should be if the country in which you are working is a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as is the case in the 3 countries in question in this project. And the way in which this definition is important is, well, there are several aspects of it. First, it is legally binding to all countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Second of all, it takes away the guesswork as to what inclusive education is and is not. So it is not possible for somebody to say, well, you know, what we are doing is inclusive education. It might not be what you are doing, but it still is inclusive education because there are many definitions to inclusive education. And I think that it's important that we understand that, as the two previous speakers have mentioned, the ways in which we enact inclusive education have to be contextual and are different from country to country and region to region. But we must have one definition of inclusive education so that we all know what it is that we are talking about, what is the aim or the principle, as Mel has called it, and what it is that we are aiming to do. This definition is included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but I think that it's important because it goes well beyond persons with disabilities. In fact, if I showed you just the paragraph and I did not tell you where that definition was coming from, you would not be able to tell that that definition was included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is important because, as the previous speakers have already mentioned, inclusive education is not about children with disabilities. Inclusive education is about all children. Systemic reform, which is the way in which I think about inclusive education and the ways in which I think that we are going to be able to make forward progress. Systemic reform aimed at creating inclusive education systems is not about children with disabilities, and it is not about maintaining the status quo. What that means is that it requires transformation, creativity, innovation. It requires that we keep in mind the principles of universality, planning, and meaningful learning, which just happen to be the principles of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning is based on the principle that every child matters and every child learns differently. In other words, we take all the ways in which children are different from each other and we capitalize on their differences. Universal design for learning does not aim to make all children learn equally. It aims to support every child to learn in the way that matters the most to them. So universal design for learning is the only way in which education can be planned to respond to the needs of a very fast-paced 21st century. Therefore, if systemic reform is to be set on the principles of UDL, as it should be, then resource allocation must also follow the principles of universality, design, which is being intentional and being purposeful, to enable meaningful learning. Before we move on to the country examples, I would like to share with you some key findings from two of the most recent UNESCO Global Education Monitoring reports. These key findings are important because although they are global in nature, they're also Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese specific. The challenges related to enacting inclusive education are the same globally. Italy, Portugal, and Spain are not alone in their struggle to find answers to their country-specific challenges. Interestingly, although we usually acknowledge our global weaknesses, we do not usually look outside of the usual suspects for global solutions. So the Global Education Monitoring Report from 2020 was, the report was specific on inclusion in education. And some of the key findings are findings that we are all very well aware of, but it's never too much to mention. First, identity, background, and ability dictate education opportunities. Second, despite progress, many countries still do not collect, report, or use data on students who are left behind. Third, something that we have all known for a very long time, and as the previous presenters have mentioned, financing needs to target those most in need. And teachers, teaching materials, and learning environments often ignore the benefits of embracing diversity. The most recent Global Education Monitoring Report 24-25 was on leadership in education. And this was a very interesting production of this report, because contrary to what would be expected, we do not know very much about leadership in education. So 3 key findings I thought are really important to framing this conversation around resources. The first one is that good schools need good school leaders, and this would seem obvious. Effective principals ensure that their schools are safe, healthy, and inclusive. However, as we know, very often school leaders are political appointees that not only have no education background, but they really do not know how to be effective in ensuring that their schools are safe, healthy, and inclusive. The second finding is that effective leadership demands fair hiring practices, trust, and growth opportunities. Professional leaders need preparation and training. Much like teachers, professional leaders need to be teachers first, but they actually also need to be prepared to be able to lead others, especially if that leadership is the type of leadership that includes a larger community. And then school leaders should not be heroes. Sharing leadership builds better schools, and sharing leadership throughout the school creates a collaborative learning environment. And I think that this speaks a little bit to the examples that Mel gave about the clusters and the schools in Portugal. Now, what is missing from this list, but it's also a finding from the 2024-2025 GEM report, is that inclusive education requires school leaders that not only believe in it, but are intentional about moving towards inclusive education, and they can find ways to collectively enact it. So as with everything else, leadership for inclusive education has to be universal, intentional, purposeful, and meant to enable meaningful learning. And now to some unusual country examples. I am going to take you to Romania, to Mongolia, and to Sierra Leone. And this is where I ask you to keep an open mind as to where we might find some of the solutions to the problems that we face in our schools today. I am going to start with Romania because all three countries in this project struggle with how to respond to the very specific issues of the Roma population. In Romania, the strategy on the Romanian government on inclusion of Romanian citizens belonging to the Roma minority for the period of 22-27 follows previously used strategies. It focuses on all areas of life, and in education, it aims to improve access to quality education for Roma students. How do they do that? One of the strategies is by having specific funding for schools that have a majority Roma population. They also use specialized grants, and these have enabled schools to develop individualized programs that meet the unique needs of Roma students, again, contextualizing. And outreach programs are aimed at supporting Roma families by raising awareness about the right to education, but also educating families about the existing support services in the community that can facilitate access to education to Roma students. Their second strategy is related to the allocation of European Union financial resources, and this happens both at the national and at local levels. And these European Union financial resources have been used specifically to target teacher training for instructing Roma students, including encouraging Roma university students to become teachers, developing culturally responsive curricula, again, very much what Simoni was just talking about, and also providing additional support services such as tutoring and counseling. In addition to the financial resources, the Romanian Ministry of Education also implemented policies to promote human resources dedicated to Roma inclusion. The first strategy, which has been extremely successful, has been a combination of mediators or liaisons between the Roma community and education institutions that help to bridge the cultural divide and encourage school enrollment. The second one is to encourage Roma teachers, sociologists, community leaders to provide teacher training on inclusive practices that addresses systemic bias. This because the challenges in the enrollment, the achievement of Roma students is not an issue related to education. It is an issue that is reflected in education, but it is actually a much broader societal systemic bias issue. So in Romania, to sum it up, the strategies have been multi-sectoral. There has been a multi-sectoral approach to the challenge of the enrollment and the achievement of the Roma population in Romania. Now I'm bringing you to Mongolia. In Mongolia, the Ministry of Education faces the unique challenge of providing equitable education to its very large nomadic population. And 4 strategies have been enacted to tackle this challenge. First, alternative education models have been put in place. Things like a mobile girl kindergarten that adapt to the seasonal migrations of the herder families. And these mobile kindergartens are run on the principle that education needs to go to the child instead of the child going to education. The second strategy on the alternative education models is to utilize and support non-formal education programs with the use of distance learning methods, such as radio broadcast and distribution of learning materials. These two alternative education models are extremely important, especially with the youngest students that actually run the risk of not going to school, or even worse, perhaps even worse, having to be away from their families at a very early age and placed in boarding schools. The Mongolian government has also secured financial investments from international NGOs, from the World Bank, from UNESCO, from UNICEF, from UNDP, to improve the conditions of boarding schools while they are accelerating accessible, interactive online education models. This goes a bit to what the previous two speakers were talking about, especially Mel, this danger of separating children into different types of schools, into special education schools, into institutionalized residential facilities, which are also a type of boarding school. However, when you live thousands of miles away from a school, a boarding school has been one of the solutions found in rural areas, and this is not specific to Mongolia. This is a practice in many countries where there are large populations of rural students away from schools. The danger of boarding schools, of course, is that children are away from their families from a very, very early age. So there has to be a compromise in between improving the conditions of the boarding schools, but at the same time accelerating other models of education. And this was particularly effective during the COVID-19 pandemic. There has also been an increase of the amount of learning and teaching materials in rural schools, as well as an increase in the training of school personnel, which very often are not licensed teachers, and also training of parents in order to be able to support their children's learning at home. This is a bit of what we all saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, with the difference that in Mongolia, this is everyday life. I would even go further to say that this is everyday life to many students that live in remote rural areas in many, many countries across the world, including in Portugal. The government of Mongolia, the interesting part is that they had to take a multifaceted approach to the same problem. And this multifaceted approach includes low-tech, radio broadcasts, high-tech, online learning solutions, compromise, boarding schools as a temporary necessary evil. But there is the relentless pursuit of traditional or innovative solutions for a deeply revered cultural challenge. And I think that this is extremely important, that we understand that we are not changing cultures and societies. We have to change the ways in which education reaches children without changing the ways in which children are rooted within their own locations, their families, their societies, and their cultures. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Sierra Leone, and I think that many of you are familiar with this example. In Sierra Leone, systemic reform is also called radical inclusion, and it was initially designed to address the gender gap in education. However, with the COVID-19 pandemic, this radical inclusion approach quickly demonstrated that a broader approach was needed. And so the national policy on radical inclusion in schools was born in 2021. It is a last first approach, which I find very interesting way of saying we are going to look at the most disadvantaged students first. And it aims to eliminate barriers for marginalized groups of children, especially girls, especially pregnant girls and young girls who are both parents and learners, children with disabilities, children in rural and hard-to-reach places, and children from low-income families. The implementation plans envisioned, amongst other things, the development, the financial resources, so twofold, a free quality school education provision, which means that children are provided for free with both the materials and anything that they need to be able to attend school. And there was a removal of school fees. And there's also budget allocations, primarily with financial incentives from international partnerships and donor funding for infrastructure, starting with accessibility, learning materials, and teacher training. The second part of these implementation plans had to do with human resources. So human resources focuses on the identification of students at risk, the learning of inclusive practices, and increasing the number of teachers in underserved areas. In addition, they have created inclusion champions at the school level, and they have also introduced the idea of classroom assistants. What was found was that it requires ongoing monitoring and evaluation, and the measures that I just spoke to you about, some of which were experimental, are now included in the 2023 Basic and Senior Secondary Education Act that aligns and reinforces the radical inclusion policy in education with other radical inclusion policies in different sectors, and it provides a national legal framework. So, as Mel was saying at the beginning, using radical inclusion has the principle as the motor that drives inclusive education forward. Now, I understand that when you look at Sierra Leone, these measures might seem very basic. They might even seem old-fashioned in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. But if you take into consideration that they were enacted in a low resource country, what they have accomplished in 4 years is astounding. And it is not necessarily a matter of financial investment. It was interesting listening to Simoni previously, because for me, in all of the years in which I have worked in international development, usually government people, the first thing that they say is, there's no money. And my answer is always, there is money. Because the money needs to be moved from where it has previously been, which is usually in segregated settings, to other settings that are actually leading to more inclusive practices. The themes that run through your project, the key findings from global research, the challenges of the 3 country examples are all the same. They have been the same since we all started on this journey towards systemic reform for inclusive education. And so the takeaways that I would like to invite you to consider are the following. First, you need to act with urgency. Not engaging in intentional and purposeful systemic reform will only serve to maintain the status quo. So you will have the same challenges and no solutions. Collaborate within and across all settings, because you never know where the good ideas are going to come from. You need to tackle the same challenges from various fronts, because one challenge is going to have, more than likely, multiple solutions. And don't be afraid to fail. You have to try and fail. That is what meaningful learning, the 3rd pillar of UDL, is. Meaningful learning does not happen without setbacks. And lastly, data, and more data. Data is your friend. You have to measure. Of course, you have to know what it is that you're measuring. And of course, you have to be intentional in your measurement. Of course, you have to measure participation, but you also have to measure money. And you have to know where money is going. You have to know where your financial allocations are actually being allocated, because perhaps that is where you are going to find some of the answers you are looking for. I am going to leave you with the very simple words from Dr. David Sengay, who was the proportioner to radical inclusion. He says, when we build solutions in normal times, we're not usually leading with inclusion. We're not thinking about everyone. But in an emergency, solutions must include all people, because everyone is vulnerable. The key lesson is that solutions should work for everyone. The slides have some of the resources that were used in this presentation. Many other resources are available. And of course, I am always happy to discuss with you not only what I have shared with you here, but also ideas and examples from far and wide. So thank you very much for your attention. Diana?
Paula, thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely fascinating. And the example, we have so much to learn and so much to think about with examples from other countries who deal with things in completely different ways and have different contexts. But as you have said, so many of the challenges are similar. It's possibly a question of degree or so it is really interesting. And thank you so much for bringing all that together. And bringing in all the aspects of resourcing from what Simoni has said and all the things that Mel had introduced at the beginning. Many of these things, of course, they're all interlinked. While people are perhaps thinking of questions they might like to put or comments for Simoni and to Paula and eventually to Mel, if there are further questions, my colleague Gamza has something that she would wish to present. Gamza.
Yes, I just quickly wanted to inform you about a feedback survey. I have put a link into the chat where you will be able to fill out a survey. We would very much love to receive your feedback on this webinar in order to improve our future webinars. So yeah, that is mainly it from me. Again, it is linked in the chat.
Thank you, Gamza. So people can be looking at that in the chat. Now, there were so many things that we could be asking you about. I think we could probably be here all night. But I would really invite you as participants to put some questions or some comments to our speakers, because there are so many things here that are relevant for our three countries of Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Resourcing, of course, cuts across everything for all three countries. These are issues, how to tackle these challenges, the challenges of regional disparities and diversities, the Roma, for example, but there are other minorities. We talked about people who come into the country, perhaps as immigrants or migrants with different language backgrounds, all sorts of things. And there are many, many points that could be raised. So I invite you to put your questions, to pose your questions if you can. Thank you. I see there's a question here in Portuguese. Is somebody able to give me a, yeah, thank you. Someone's just typing me. Thank you, Pedro, he's typing an answer. I'm sorry, my Portuguese is not up to the level required to translate a question here. I apologize. In the interim, please, if anybody else has a question. I have two comments, one for Simoni and one for Paula, but perhaps I'll read one out first while that's coming. Question for Simoni. Simoni, this person is, and I think this is a comment on the situation in response to something you've said. Nowadays in Portugal, there is little or no time to do anything to support the students, contrary to what has been said. EE support teachers are few and far between, and with the inclusion of refugee pupils, the teacher doesn't have the time to deal with the number of pupils in the class. In short, the diversity is great and the teacher is unique, I think just one, and today is a true facilitator. And not a teacher who transmits knowledge. Another problem is assessment for career progression. I don't know if you wish to respond to that in any way, Simoni, or just leave that hanging as a comment from a participant.
It's the challenges we already made. The systems are not really committed to inclusive education in some cases. There are regional disparities. There are disparities among schools. So I'm going back to what I said earlier in the presentation. We need to make better use of our teachers, of our staff, to increase collaboration between them, to increase co-teaching between them. And of course, teachers and all the staff at school need support. We can't expect teachers to find all the solutions by themselves. They need support. They need ongoing professional development at school level. They need some things to be done beforehand for them, like materials. So unless we understand how important it is to put all this investment in materials, resources, teacher professional learning, I think it will be very difficult to move forward, and we end up reproducing the needs-based approach that we were talking about earlier.
Wow. Thank you, Simoni. That is so true. I have a comment, Paula, for you, and then I have a comment also for Mel in a moment, if I may. Paula, this person is saying, how can we talk about resources if we have obsolete computer equipment in schools, packed by the classrooms, and in some schools, no sports halls for good practice of physical education to combat the scourge of the 21st century, that is obesity? How much priority is given to mathematics, if we must know, and give importance to the life sciences as well as the natural sciences? Do you wish to respond to that comment in any way?
Well, I think that how much we have, how many resources we have, what resources we have is in the eye of the beholder. And I am always shocked being Portuguese and going and working outside of Portugal and coming from a family of teachers and being a teacher myself. It is always shocking to me how Portuguese teachers are always complaining that they don't have resources, when in reality, you are one of the best resourced country that I have ever worked in, which is the reason why you are also one of the most advanced countries when it comes to inclusive education. The case of radical inclusion in Sierra Leone, for example, that is an example of a country with no resources. And they have done brilliant work with no resources, basically no resources. This is much more a question of being creative with what you have and reallocating what you have than it is a question of how can I do something when I have obsolete computers in my school. I understand you have obsolete computers in your school, but you have computers. And there are many countries where they don't even have electricity. And kids go to school and kids achieve and kids go and study abroad. So it's all really a question of perspective and a question of looking at how can you be inclusive in principle with no resources. And maybe Mel, who has traveled more extensively than me, can say something about that as well.
No,
Thank you,
I agree with
Paula.
that. And I mean, it seems to me that the moral responsibility is to make the best use of the resources you've got. At the same time, arguing for more resources. And of course, it's very handy when you've got a general election coming up, as you have in Portugal, to say to people, let's have better resources in the school. And I think as citizens, we need to do that. But as I had hinted at, and I think it came through the other two presentations, the most important resource is the human resource. And adults, but of course, also children and young people. I think we've only scratched the surface of how children themselves can be active partners in the improvement of their schools. And, that's a kind of mindset, I think, that you see in a sense, or not to say this to a ridiculous level, but the more children there are, the more resources you've got.
Yes, what an interesting point. Yes, of course. There's a question here in related to that, Mel. Somebody is asking, what is your perspective on the funding model in Portugal? That's a direct question.
I'm not sure that I'm up to date on the funding matter, so
Okay.
I can't comment on. There probably is in the report, which is rather long, I have to say, but if you just search it, I'm sure you'll find something. One thing I did want to add, which I meant to say, is, my argument is that movements based on inclusion and equity are a pathway to excellence. Now, that's kind of counterintuitive to many people. You're saying if you're going to make the schools more, having to cater for children who need more help, won't that distract attention? But that's where Portugal is so interesting. During the 20 years of its reform process, on the PISA tests that are done every 4 years, where countries are compared, the wealthy countries, in terms of language, reading, maths, and so on, Portugal has improved almost every time. It's been on a trajectory of improvement. So Portugal is a very good illustrative example. And I must say, I use it a lot in other parts of the world to say, look, what's happened in Portugal has made the system more inclusive, but it's actually a better education system for all kids. So inclusion and equity, a pathway to excellence.
Thank you. Just I have a comment for Paula in a moment, but I also think there are many, many comments that are coming in saying, thanking you all for your presentations and saying, they've taken the words out of my mouth, of course, but coming from our participants, this is really, they are thanking you very much. They have found everything really interesting, all three presentations. They've really enjoyed the examples from different regions, and congratulations is the word that is coming to you. And everything has been very inspiring and interesting. So I echo that completely. I have one last question for you, Paula, if you would like, and we'll make this our last one. It's from Portugal. The comment is, many thanks for the excellent webinar. Paula, how do you deal with the systemic weakness of lack of monitoring of implementation as regards inclusive education, which is so crucial? Sorry, is that clear? It's to do with the lack of monitoring and implementation in general, I think.
Lack of monitoring is the evil of all evils everywhere. It's not just in Portugal. If you speak to a minister of education and you ask them, can you please explain to me where your money went last year? They will probably give you general ideas, but they will not be able to actually give you numbers. And so monitoring is extremely important. For me, when I work, and one of the reasons why I always speak to children is because for me, children and their opinion are the best possible data gathering mechanism that you have. If you don't ask children if they feel that they are learning and that they belong and that they have friends and they're happy to get out of bed in the morning to go to school and they have a good group outside of school, if you don't ask children, you don't know. You can monitor everything that you want. You can monitor money coming in, money going out, the number of school lunches you have. You can monitor the number of teachers. You can monitor anything. But if you do not monitor, if you don't keep a hand on the pulse of how children, who are ultimately your clients, how they think about how the system is functioning, then you're not collecting the right data. And that's where I would leave it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think I leave that there for the comments and questions from our participants. But on behalf of the European Agency, I do wish to thank you. And this comes from my team as well. We're in this together as a project. There are many of us. To thank you very much indeed for your presentations, your wisdom and your experience and your thoughts and your willingness to have shared that so openly with us all. There is a great deal that we can learn from everything you've said, and the way the three of you have really built a very intensive picture of what is required and what is available. And I think how we need to change our thinking. I think that's the key message that we have to get across, that, as you said, Paula, a few moments ago, you have something and you can, ideas come from everywhere, and be open to things and learn what has worked elsewhere and see how we can adapt that to other contexts and so on. So I would thank you very much indeed for what you have done, for your preparation and hard work in these excellent presentations, which we have really greatly enjoyed. I think we will be able to we will send your presentations. We will share the presentations with the participants at a time after this, and we will be adding some additional information and resources to that. And my thanks also go to all of you who have given up your time at the end of the afternoon to come to our webinar and be part of this. And I think that's all from us, and from that we will leave you. Thank you.